He was the man the revolution was supposed to belong to, the one who built the army from mud and railway sleepers, the one who stood on the armored train and made veteran troops cry with a single sentence, the one whose name every foreigner in Moscow mentioned when they were asked who would come after the old man with the beard. And in the end, he died in a quiet house in a suburb of Mexico City, his skull split by an ice axe, his face turned toward the man he had just bitten on the hand. How does a story like that happen? How does the heir apparent become a corpse in exile, hunted across 3 continents by a government he once helped build? The answer is not one decision. It is a chain of them, and it begins long before anyone had ever heard of Joseph Stalin. To understand how Trotsky lost, you have to understand what Russia looked like when he first mattered. The Romanov dynasty, 300 years of continuous rule over an empire that stretched across 11 time zones, was finished. The First World War had cracked it from the outside, hunger had rotted it from within, and in a single feverish week in February 1917, the whole structure simply came apart. The Tsar abdicated. The army began to dissolve. Villages, regiments, entire cities began answering to no one. It was the kind of vacuum that does not last long. Either someone fills it, or the country tears itself apart. Into that vacuum stepped a small, disciplined organization of professional revolutionaries called the Bolsheviks, led by a lawyer-turned-agitator named Vladimir Lenin. At his right hand stood a younger man, angular, sharp-featured, with a gift for language that almost no one in the party could match. Leon Davidovich Bronstein, who had long since taken the nom de guerre Trotsky. He was not yet the most famous revolutionary in Russia. He would be. His life up to that point had been a preparation for exactly this kind of moment. He was born in 1879 in Ukraine into a Jewish farming family that was prosperous enough to send its children to school, and poor enough, in the eyes of the surrounding Christian villages, to make them strangers wherever they went. The double inheritance shaped him. As a teenager, he read Marxist literature almost secretly, and by 17 he was already organizing. At 18 he was arrested. The Tsarist police were efficient in their way, and Siberia was the standard reply. He was sent east, watched, guarded. He escaped on a forged passport and surfaced in Europe, where he spent years moving through the underground networks of socialist exiles, writing, arguing, splitting factions, building a reputation among a tiny international elite as a man who would not stop thinking. The years between his escape and 1917 were years of waiting. He was in Vienna when the war broke out. He was in New York when the February Revolution came. He hurried back, and by the time the decisive moment arrived in October, he was on the ground in Petrograd while Lenin was still finishing his journey from exile. Trotsky coordinated the military side of the seizure of power. Lenin gave the orders, Trotsky made them happen. For a few weeks, it looked like the kind of partnership that might outlast the revolution itself. It did not, because the old Russian state had no army left to offer the new one. World War I had chewed through the imperial force. Desertion, mutiny, and simple starvation had done the rest. The Bolsheviks faced civil war on every front, with foreign armies intervening on the edges, and they needed a military from scratch. In early 1918, Lenin gave Trotsky the job of Commissar of War. He was a civilian. He had never commanded soldiers. He took it anyway. What followed was one of the most concentrated feats of military organization in modern history. Trotsky took the broken remnants of regiments, detachments of sailors, raw peasant volunteers, former prisoners of war, anyone willing to hold a rifle, and in 3 years of brutal fighting, turned them into a force capable of defeating the white generals and pushing back the expeditionary armies sent by Britain, France, the United States, and Japan. He did it from armored trains that ran on patched-together railway lines, crossing front to front, appearing where the line was about to break, issuing orders, denouncing cowards, decorating heroes on the spot. His personal style was theatrical in a way that would have been comic in a peacetime politician. In a country that was dying, it worked. Soldiers who despised their officers wept when Trotsky pinned a medal on their chest and used their name. Generals who had been court-martialing their own men took his calls. By the end of the Civil War, Trotsky was not just a successful war leader. He was, by any honest accounting, the second most powerful man in the Soviet state, and by some measures, the first. He was also, unlike most of his rivals, a public figure. Foreign journalists who managed to get into Russia came back with the same impression. In 1922, the American writer Max Eastman returned from Moscow and published a long article in the influential journal Foreign Affairs. His conclusion was blunt. Among the mass of the Russian people, Trotsky was at that moment more popular than Lenin himself. The claim was exaggerated, but it was not fantasy. In a country where politics was performed in giant meeting halls, in train stations, on the decks of battleships, Trotsky was the man the crowds waited for. And yet, at almost exactly the moment his authority reached its peak, Lenin began to die. The first serious stroke came in 1922. The second followed before the year was out. By the spring of 1923, the founder of the Soviet state could no longer reliably speak. The question that had been whispered for years could no longer be postponed. Who comes next? Within the party, the answer seemed obvious. It was the man who had won the war. It was the man whose name was on every wall. It was Trotsky. Lenin himself appears to have agreed, at least in part. In the formal hierarchy of the Soviet state, the most explicit public signal of succession was the position of deputy chairman of the Council of People's Commissars. The chairman was, effectively, the head of government. The deputy, by long Bolshevik convention, was the heir apparent. In the last months before his final collapse, Lenin offered Trotsky that position. He offered it in a way that left no doubt about what he meant. Trotsky refused. He refused again. The reasons he gave were characteristic. The title, he said, would make him Lenin's understudy, which insulted him. He had other concerns. He had theoretical work. He had the global revolution to think about. He had, in the language of his later enemies, the luxury of a man who believed he would win anyway. This is the hinge of the entire story, and almost no one saw it as a hinge at the time. A man who had been offered the formal crown of the Soviet state by the dying founder of the Soviet state had turned it down, twice, for reasons of personal pride. In any ordinary succession, this would have been a curious anecdote. In the Bolshevik succession, where every formal position was a weapon and every committee chairmanship was a front line, it was a strategic catastrophe. The man who refused the title did not prevent the succession. He only made sure that whoever took the title would define the succession instead. Because while Trotsky was thinking about permanent revolution, another man was doing something almost unimaginably boring by comparison. That man was Joseph Stalin, a Georgian-born Bolshevik who had been sitting, since the spring of 1922, in a chair that almost no one had thought to look at. The chair was called the General Secretary of the Communist Party. At the moment Stalin took it, it was widely considered a clerical position. Stalin was a useful party administrator. He moved paper, he moved people. He was not a theoretician. He was not a general. He was not a charismatic speaker. He was, in the polite judgment of the senior Bolsheviks, the kind of man you assigned a difficult task to because he would do it without complaining and without taking credit. That, of course, is exactly the kind of man you should fear. In the next part, we are going to look at what Stalin quietly built while Trotsky was busy being magnificent, and why the personality that made Trotsky a hero in the Civil War was the same personality that destroyed him in the corridors of the party. There is a particular kind of history in which the most dangerous person in the room is not the one at the podium. It is the one at the desk in the corner, working through a stack of papers while everyone else argues about the future of mankind. By late 1922, Joseph Stalin had been sitting at that desk for almost a year. The desk was in the office of the General Secretary of the Communist Party. The chair was, on paper, one of the least important in the Soviet state. In practice, it was about to become the most important one on Earth. Almost nobody understood this at the time. To understand how invisible Stalin was to the men who supposedly ran the revolution with him, it helps to read the book that defined the revolution for the outside world. 10 Days That Shook the World was written by the American journalist John Reed, an eyewitness to the Bolshevik seizure of power in Petrograd. Reed was not a hostile witness. He was, in fact, an admirer. He spent years inside the revolution, knew many of its leaders personally, and produced what is still the most widely read English-language account of those events. Stalin barely appears in it. The book is full of Lenin, full of Trotsky, full of soldiers, sailors, and factory workers, and almost silent about the man who would, within 7 years, rule the entire Soviet Union by himself. That absence is not an oversight. It is the single most revealing detail about how the Bolsheviks themselves ranked their colleagues in 1917. Stalin, in those years, was a useful man. He was trusted with difficult and sometimes violent organizational work behind the front lines. He was one of the few senior Bolsheviks who came from the non-Russian periphery of the empire, which made him useful for party work among Georgians, Armenians, and the nationalities of the Caucasus. He was a competent editor of the party newspaper. He was, in the dry phrase used by Lenin at one point, a good, practical worker. Practical worker. Think about what that label actually meant. It meant that Stalin was the person you called when the party needed a printing press moved, a factional dispute smoothed over, a particularly stubborn bureaucrat persuaded. He was not the person you called to write a manifesto, deliver a speech that would empty the streets, or design a strategy for world revolution. He was a fixer. In the Bolshevik pantheon, fixers were important but small. The position of General Secretary was, in theory, exactly the kind of job a fixer would get. The Communist Party had just reorganized itself after the Civil War. It had grown from a clandestine organization of revolutionaries into a mass party of hundreds of thousands of members, and then, in the Great Purges of 1921, had been purged back down to a disciplined core. The party needed an apparatus to keep track of its members, its cells, its committees, its regional organizations, its newspapers, its schools, its finances. The man in charge of that apparatus was the General Secretary. He decided who was on which committee. He decided who was sent to which province. He decided whose file received the note of approval and whose file received a note that would quietly end a career. He did not, in the official ideology of the Bolshevik Party, decide policy. Policy was decided by the Politburo, the small cabinet at the top. The General Secretary was meant to be a clerk. The clerks of history rarely take power, except in one kind of state. The Soviet state was exactly that one kind. In a country where one party was the state, where the army, the trade unions, the courts, the press, the schools, and the economy were all in some sense arms of that party, the party itself was the central nervous system. Whoever controlled the central nervous system controlled the body. And the central nervous system ran, in the most literal sense, through personnel files. Stalin understood this almost instinctively. Trotsky did not. To see the contrast, picture the two men in late 1922 and through 1923. Trotsky was ill. He had been sent south to the Caucasus to recover, and he spent months away from Moscow, writing pamphlets on the international situation, drafting theoretical articles, arguing with the European left about the pace of revolution in the West. His mind was on the world. Stalin was in Moscow. While Trotsky was reading proofs in the mountain air, Stalin was on the telephone, the telegraph, the long handwritten note. He was placing his allies in the Org Bureau, the organizational bureau of the Central Committee, which was the body that actually decided who went where in the party. He was shifting the membership of regional committees. He was promoting loyal men to positions where they would be useful in the next Congress, and quietly marginalizing men he could not count on. He was building a machine. The machine was made of paper, but paper, in a one-party state, is more durable than steel. The official ideology of the party held that policy mattered more than personnel, that principle mattered more than position, that the correct line on the world revolution would carry the day. Stalin, who was not a man given to grand speeches, seems to have understood that in a revolutionary party full of proud men who had risked their lives for an idea, the dull business of who gets the next committee assignment was the actual battleground. You do not need to win the argument if you control who votes on it. While this was happening, Trotsky was making the kind of enemies that brilliant men make quickly and shed slowly. Part of it was structural. He was a Jew from Ukraine operating in a Russian party that had its own complicated suspicions. He had only returned to Russia after the February Revolution, which made him, in the eyes of those who had spent years underground, a recent arrival. He had disagreed with Lenin openly on crucial questions during the war, had led a faction, had been humiliated, had rejoined the party. He had held high command during the Civil War, and had used that high command ruthlessly, ordering executions of deserters, ordering the militarization of trade unions, running the trains that ended mutinies by force. The men who loved him for that were the men who had fought under him. The men who hated him for it were the men on the receiving end, and many of them sat on the Central Committee. But part of it was also, plainly, him. A senior figure of the Communist International named Angelika Balabanov knew Trotsky well. She had worked beside him in exile, had watched him rise, and was not a woman inclined to flattery. Her description of him was unsparing. Trotsky, she said, had an arrogance that equaled his gifts, and that arrogance created a distance between himself and those around him, a distance that excluded both personal warmth and any feeling of equality. It is worth sitting with that sentence. It is the testimony of a woman who was not his enemy. She was describing the cost of being the smartest person in the room. The cost is that nobody else wants to be in the room with you. His first wife, Alexandra Sokolovskaya, had been arrested with him in the early years of his revolutionary life, had gone to Siberia with him, had borne his children in exile. She had known him as a young man, before the fame, before the trains. Asked, late in life, about the pride for which he was famous, she offered a small correction. Arrogance, she said, would be a better word than pride. Two women, two different vantage points, and the same verdict. Even Lenin, in the political testament he would begin dictating at the end of that same year, flagged the same problem. Of all the senior Bolsheviks, Trotsky, Lenin wrote, was perhaps the most capable man in the present Central Committee, but he displayed an excessive self-assurance that bordered on a refusal to treat colleagues as equals. Lenin loved Trotsky. Lenin needed Trotsky. Lenin was also, by the end, worried about him, for exactly the reason the two women were. A revolutionary party is not a collection of generals. It is a brotherhood of plotters who have spent their adult lives in cellars and in exile. The currency of that brotherhood is not brilliance. It is loyalty, reliability, the willingness to share risk, the willingness to admit error. Trotsky had all the brilliance. He did not have the rest. And he did not see, because he could not see, that he did not have it. That is the mechanism that was working on him, and it is worth understanding because it is not unique to Bolsheviks. In any organization made up of people who have suffered for an idea, the man who makes others feel small will be obeyed as long as he is winning, and abandoned the moment he is not. The same room that cheered his speeches in 1919 would not warn him of the knife in 24. Making people feel small means that when you stumble, they will not catch you. They will wait, carefully, for the moment they can stop following you, and then they will. Stalin, who made almost no one feel small because he made almost no one feel anything, was building that waiting room. He was filling the org bureau with men who owed their positions to him. He was promoting the second-rate, the obedient, the colorless. He was making sure that when the time came to count votes, the votes that mattered were his. He was also doing something subtler. He was identifying the men around Trotsky who had been humiliated by him at some point, the men whose careers he had blocked, the men whose pride he had bruised, and he was quietly opening doors to them. He did not need Trotsky's enemies. He only needed men willing to dislike him. In a party of proud revolutionaries, that turned out to be most of them. By the time Trotsky returned from the Caucasus in the winter of 1923, the apparatus he had ignored had been quietly rearranged. The clerk in the corner had been doing his job. The orator on the stage had been doing his. The clerk was now ready. The orator was not. Lenin, in the meantime, was trying to write a warning from his sickbed. What he wrote and what happened to it is the story of the next part. By December of 1922, Vladimir Lenin could no longer run the country he had built. The strokes had done their work. He could dictate in short bursts, but his political life was ending in real time. He knew it. He also knew that the question of who would come after him was not theoretical, and that the wrong answer would destroy everything. So he did what revolutionaries do in extremis. He sat down, with the secretaries taking notes, and began to dictate what historians would come to call his testament. The document was not a single text. It was a series of dictated notes assessing the senior Bolsheviks he had led for 2 decades, and a final, separate postscript added in January of 1923. Lenin did not flatter anyone. He wrote about his colleagues the way a senior surgeon writes about colleagues who will inherit his practice, with a mixture of professional respect and clinical worry. 2 men received particular attention. The first was Trotsky. Lenin described him, with what was almost a sigh, as perhaps the most capable man in the present Central Committee. It was the kind of compliment that, coming from Lenin, carried the weight of an empire. Then came the warning. Trotsky displayed excessive self-assurance, Lenin wrote. He was too inclined to display his superiority over colleagues. He was administratively careless, prone to treating the party machine as an inconvenience. In another country, in another party, these would have been the complaints of a difficult colleague. In the Bolshevik Party, where loyalty and equality among comrades were considered sacred, they were a slow-acting poison. The second man was Stalin. Here Lenin's tone was different. He was not assessing a brilliant theorist. He was assessing a fixer who had been given too much authority. Stalin, Lenin wrote, had accumulated too much power in the general secretary position, and having concentrated that power in his hands, he was not certain he would always use it with sufficient care. The remedy Lenin proposed was concrete. The comrades should find a way to remove Stalin from that position and replace him with someone more tolerant, more loyal, less inclined to abuse the apparatus he had been handed. Lenin's stated goal in his final months of political life was, in plain language, to fire the man who was about to inherit the revolution. He did not get the chance. On the 9th of March, 1923, Lenin suffered a third stroke. It was devastating. He never again spoke on matters of policy. The hand that had been writing the warning stopped moving. The testament, completed and dictated, sat in the safe of his secretary, and the question of whether it would ever be read aloud to the party became a question of raw political power. Lenin died on the 21st of January, 1924. The succession war began almost immediately. It began, in fact, before Lenin was in the ground. In May of 1922, more than a year before the third stroke, Stalin had already concluded that Trotsky was the most dangerous rival. He had done what a careful politician does in such a situation. He had not attacked Trotsky directly. He had found two allies in the Politburo who had their own reasons to want Trotsky stopped, and he had stitched together a quiet alliance. The first was Grigory Zinoviev, the boss of the party organization in Leningrad, an old Bolshevik with a taste for ceremony and a thin skin. The second was Lev Kamenev, a soft-faced intellectual who had famously hesitated at the moment of the October seizure of power and had been harshly judged for it. Together, the three of them became known by a word borrowed from the Roman triumph, the Troika. The Troika's primary purpose, openly stated in private letters, was to prevent Trotsky from succeeding Lenin. The instrument they chose was simple and almost unanswerable. They would keep the testament suppressed. As long as Lenin's specific warning about Stalin was locked in a safe, Stalin remained the general secretary. As long as Stalin remained the general secretary, he controlled the appointments. As long as he controlled the appointments, he controlled the votes. The Troika understood that in a one-party state, a piece of paper sitting unread in a desk was worth more than a speech in the largest hall in Moscow. Then came the funeral. It is one of the most carefully staged scenes in Soviet history. Lenin died in the early morning. The party leadership had hours to decide how to bury him. Stalin took charge. He organized the funeral, the embalming, the laying in state, the placement of the coffin in the hall of columns at the House of the Trade Unions, where thousands would file past. He helped carry the coffin. He stood at the head of the procession. He delivered a public oath, in language that was almost religious, vowing to keep faith with Lenin's work, to be a faithful executor of his testament, to maintain the unity of the party as Lenin would have wished. Stalin, who had been a secondary figure a year earlier, now stood as the mourner-in-chief of the Soviet state. Trotsky was not there. He was in the Caucasus, recovering from a long illness. He had been ill for months. He had not been in Moscow when Lenin died. He received a telegram from Stalin giving the precise date and time of the funeral, and gently suggesting that, given the distance and the state of his health, there was no point in making the long trip. Trotsky, in his later writings, claimed that the date had been deliberately altered to keep him away. The documentary record is suggestive rather than conclusive. What is not in dispute is the political result. The man who was supposed to be the heir was absent. The man who was supposed to be the administrator carried the coffin. The photograph that ran in every newspaper in the world showed Stalin at the head of the bier. The optics were already set, and they would not be undone. By May of 1924, the 13th Party Congress opened. The testament was finally read aloud. The reading took place in a restricted session, with delegations but without the wider party membership present. Trotsky was in the room. The moment was his. Lenin's own words had just been spoken, warning of his excessive self-assurance. Lenin's own words had just been spoken, calling for Stalin to be removed from his position. Any shrewd politician would have used the moment. Trotsky did not. His reasoning was characteristically high-minded. To press the issue, he said, would split the party. To demand Stalin's removal would look divisive at exactly the moment the party needed to appear unified. He would not be the man who broke the unity Lenin had preached. He stayed silent. He did not move against Stalin. He did not demand a vote. He trusted that his prestige, his record, his obvious moral claim to the leadership would carry the day. Zinoviev and Kamenev, who had supposedly been Stalin's allies against Trotsky, now performed the most cynical maneuver of the entire succession. They argued, in the closed session, that Stalin had to be kept in his position. They needed him. They needed the apparatus. They needed his organizational machine to shut Trotsky out. So they defended the very man Lenin had asked them to remove. Stalin, with the theatrical humility he was perfecting even then, offered his resignation. The offer was refused. He was back in his seat before the meeting adjourned. The testament was buried. The Bolshevik Party had been told by its dying founder that the man in the General Secretary's chair was a danger. It had chosen to keep him there. Anatoly Lunacharsky, one of the senior Bolsheviks, and a man who had known Trotsky for years, delivered a quiet verdict that summed up the tragedy. Trotsky, Lunacharsky said, was extremely bad at organizing, not just the party, but even a small group within it. He had practically no wholehearted supporters. The man who could hold an army together with the force of his personality could not hold a faction together with the force of his friendships. He had influence, he had admirers, he had crowds. He did not have people in the political sense. And in the political sense, people win. There is a small detail that captures the psychological trap Trotsky had walked into. He had a private label for Stalin. He called him the gray blur. He used it in correspondence, in private conversations, occasionally in guarded public remarks. Stalin was a mediocrity, a colorless bureaucrat, a man of no real intellectual standing, beneath serious engagement. The contempt was not entirely wrong. It was also fatal. The contempt blinded Trotsky to the specific danger Stalin represented. You cannot outmaneuver a man whose existence you have already decided is not worth your attention. You cannot defend against a man whose threat level you have privately classified as negligible. The gray blur was reorganizing the entire Bolshevik Party, and the most brilliant man in it was declining to look. By 1926, the trap closed. Zinoviev and Kamenev finally realized that Stalin had been using them. The alliance of convenience had outlived its purpose, and Stalin was now methodically stripping them of their bases. In desperation, they turned to Trotsky, and together the three formed what was called the United Opposition. It was the last serious internal challenge to Stalin. It was also too late. The apparatus had already been built. The loyalists were already in place. The votes were already counted. Stalin turned to a weapon of his own. In 1921, during the chaos of the Civil War, Lenin had imposed a ban on internal factionalism within the party. Factions were declared illegal. Discipline was declared paramount. The rule had been designed to suppress dissent in the middle of a war. Stalin now used it as a peacetime instrument of purge. He accused Trotsky, Zinoviev, and Kamenev of forming an illegal faction. The charge was technically accurate. It was also politically decisive. In November of 1927, all three were expelled from the Communist Party. In January of 1928, Trotsky was deported to Alma-Ata, the old imperial city in the far south of Kazakhstan, on the edge of the Chinese frontier. It was supposed to be the end of his political life. He was cut off from Moscow, cut off from his allies, cut off from the apparatus he had refused to learn to operate. In February of 1929, in a final act of banishment, he was put on a boat and expelled from the Soviet Union entirely. The man who had stood on the armored train, who had built the Red Army, who had been offered the succession twice and refused it twice, who had stayed silent when Lenin's testament was read, who had missed the funeral, who had called his rival a gray blur, who had never built a faction and never made a friend when he needed one, was now a man with nowhere left to go. The next part of the story is about what happened to him after he crossed the border, and about the patience of a man who never stopped hunting him. When the boat that carried Leon Trotsky left the port of Odessa in February of 1929, it was carrying the most famous exile in the world. He was 50 years old. He had no country. He had no party. He had no army. He had, in a battered suitcase, a manuscript, a few personal papers, and the beginnings of what would become one of the most bitter autobiographies ever written by a politician still alive. For the next 11 years, Joseph Stalin would not stop trying to kill him. The geography of those 11 years is itself a story about the power Stalin now commanded. Trotsky applied for asylum in country after country. Some refused him outright. Others initially agreed and then reversed themselves within weeks, as the Soviet diplomatic machine made clear, in polite but unmistakable terms, the consequences of sheltering the man. He spent productive months in Turkey, on the island of Principe in the Sea of Marmara, writing furiously. He moved on to France, where the authorities granted him a visa, and then, under pressure from Moscow, refused to extend it. He moved on to Norway, where the government initially allowed him to settle, and then, faced with the threat of a Soviet trade collapse in the far north, interned him in a small coastal town under conditions that were technically not imprisonment, but bore a strong family resemblance. Each move cost him time, books, allies, and money. Each move was also a small victory for Stalin, because each refusal told the rest of the European left that sheltering Trotsky was a serious inconvenience. By the time he was allowed to land in Mexico in late 1936, he had been bounced across 3 continents and was dependent on the hospitality of a government 3,000 miles from Moscow. While he wandered, Stalin was dismantling everything Trotsky had ever been. The destruction was not aimed at the exile alone. It was aimed at everyone who had ever been near him. This is a feature of the Soviet system under Stalin that is easy to underestimate from a distance. Stalin did not merely defeat his enemies, he erased them, and then he erased the memory of them. Trotsky's sons were pursued. His first son, Sergei, who had been a quiet Soviet engineer and had never been involved in politics, was arrested in 1935 and disappeared into the prison system. His death was never officially acknowledged. His second son, the older Lev, had already died earlier in the exile years. His younger son, Sergei Sedov, was arrested, tortured, and used as a lever to extract confessions from old Bolsheviks at the great Moscow show trials of the late 1930s. The most famous of those trials, the trial of the Old Guard in 1936 and the trial of the generals in 1937, were not really trials at all. They were scripted productions in which defendants who had known Lenin personally recited, under instruction, fantastical confessions that implicated Trotsky as the supposed mastermind of every plot, sabotage, and treason the Soviet state was then inventing. Defendants who refused to confess were beaten. Defendants who confessed were shot anyway. Almost every name on the long list of people Trotsky had once worked with ended up either executed or vanished. The Bolshevik Party that had seized power in 1917 was being quietly replaced, year by year, with a different party whose only loyalty was to the man at the top. Trotsky watched all of this from Mexico. He had been granted asylum by the government of Lázaro Cárdenas, partly out of ideological sympathy, and partly because hosting the world's most famous exile was a way of asserting Mexican independence from great power pressure. He settled in the working-class suburb of Coyoacán, on the southern edge of Mexico City. Over time, his house became a small fortress. The walls were thickened, watchtowers were added, bodyguards were hired, some of them American and European volunteers who had served in earlier leftist causes, some of them Mexican. The perimeter was patrolled, visitors were checked. Still, it did not keep the world out. In May of 1940, a small armed team actually stormed the compound, exchanging fire with the guards and wounding Trotsky's 14-year-old grandson in the foot. The raid failed. Trotsky survived. Stalin was not finished. The man who finally reached him had been working on it for years. His name was Ramon Mercader, a Spanish communist who had been recruited into the Soviet intelligence services as a young man and had been given, over many months, a new identity and a long, patient assignment. He had approached Trotsky's circle as a sympathetic Belgian businessman, a man of letters, a quiet intellectual. He had cultivated relationships with people close to Trotsky. He had won enough trust to be received privately, in the inner study, on routine visits. He had waited. On the afternoon of the 20th of August, 1940, Mercader was alone with Trotsky in the study. He had brought a document, ostensibly an article for review. He asked Trotsky to read it. As Trotsky leaned over the paper, Mercader drew an ice axe from beneath his raincoat and struck downward into the crown of Trotsky's skull. The weapon was not, as it is often described, an ice pick. It was a short-handled ice axe of the kind used by mountaineers, with a sharpened pick and a flat hammerhead. It is on display today in the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C., and a faint rust mark from the assassin's bloody fingerprint is still visible on the steel. Trotsky did not die immediately. He was a man of unusual physical toughness, the same body that had survived Civil War winters on open platforms. He fought back. He bit Mercader's hand hard enough to draw blood, and as the bodyguards rushed in, he had the presence of mind to tell them to take the man alive so he could be questioned. Mercader was beaten on the spot by the guards and was held for interrogation. Trotsky was rushed to surgery. The damage was too great. He died the next day, the 21st of August, 1940. He was 60 years old. In the days that followed, an estimated 300,000 people filed past his casket in Mexico City. The number is hard to verify, and contemporary estimates varied, but the order of magnitude is not in dispute. For a man who had been declared a traitor and an enemy of the Soviet people by the government of his own country, the public response in his city of exile was enormous. Telegrams arrived from around the world. Newspapers that had refused to print his name while he was alive ran long obituaries. The house in Coyoacán is now a public museum. Stalin's name appears nowhere on it. The fate of the assassin is the detail that turns the story from tragedy into parable. Ramon Mercader was tried in a Mexican court. He refused to reveal his true identity. He served 19 years and 8 months in a Mexican prison. He was released in 1960. On his return to the Soviet Union, he was awarded the Order of Lenin and given the title Hero of the Soviet Union. The man who had killed Trotsky with an ice axe had spent 2 decades in a foreign prison for it, and his government greeted him as a hero. He had done his job. The system rewarded him the way the system rewards any functionary who performs a difficult task without complaint and without taking credit. The model that Stalin had perfected in 1922 still worked, even for the most unusual assignments. What are we to make of this story? It is tempting to treat it as a simple morality play about good and evil, and there is a sense in which that is fair. Trotsky, whatever else he was not the architect of the Gulag. Stalin was. The political dictatorship that Trotsky had warned about, and that he spent his years of exile describing in pamphlet after pamphlet, is exactly the dictatorship that emerged. On the big questions of where Stalinism was leading the Soviet Union, Trotsky was right. He was right about the bureaucracy. He was right about the dictator. He was right about the terror. He was right, and he was right, and he lost anyway. But the reason he lost is worth holding on to, because it is not unique to Bolsheviks. Trotsky believed that ideas drive history. He believed that if you wrote the correct theory, delivered the correct speech, made the correct argument in the correct committee, the correct line would carry the day. He believed, in essence, that brilliance wins. Stalin understood something different. He understood that history is driven by who sits in which chair, who owes their position to who can be counted on when the votes are taken, and who will be too afraid to vote at all. Stalin did not need to win the argument. He needed to make sure the room that voted on the argument was already his. The dullest job in the party became, in his hands, the levers of an empire. There is a counterfactual that haunts the story. If Trotsky had accepted the deputy chairmanship when Lenin offered it, twice in 1922, the formal crown of succession would have been his, and Stalin's quiet appointment game would have been much harder to play. If Trotsky had shown up at Lenin's funeral instead of accepting Stalin's telegram, the photograph at the bier would have shown the heir, not the fixer. If Trotsky had stood up at the 13th Congress in 1924 and demanded that Lenin's testament be read in full and acted upon, the suppression of the document might have been broken in public, and Stalin's removal might have been forced. If Trotsky had invested over the years in the boring work of friendship, of placing allies, of building the kind of small factional loyalty that the Bolshevik Party actually rewarded, the apparatus would not have been handed to his rival on a plate. He did not. He did not because he could not. He was built for the train. He was not built for the room. The lesson is not that brilliance is useless. The lesson is that brilliance, in politics, is only one input. It must be paired with patience, with the willingness to do the dull work, with the humility to treat colleagues as equals rather than as an audience. The man who makes everyone feel small will find, when he falls, that there is no one there to catch him. The most dangerous person in the room is rarely the most brilliant one. It is the one who has been quietly making sure that everyone else in the room already owes them something. Trotsky spent his life delivering speeches to the world. Stalin spent his 20s answering letters. By the time anyone noticed, the revolution had a new owner. The man born to rule died on a sofa in Coyoacán. The man nobody was watching died in his bed, in power, with the whole apparatus at his command. History did not say this was just. History rarely does.